I'm going to talk a little faster than I usually do. For some of you from other parts of the world, New York already is talking too fast, so I apologize, but we really do have an enormous amount of material that I want to cover this evening. It's a kind of summary of the last couple of months in terms of just some of the major economic things that have happened. Everything is going quickly. Think of it almost as a film where they've speeded up the frames. So the cowboys are jumping up and down off the horse way too fast, and you realize, oh, they're speeding up the film. So I'm going to try to go fast because the things are happening extraordinary. So very first, very brief. Last Sunday was an election in Greece. It's a country whose development I have followed from the time back around 2010 and 11, when the full force of the economic collapse of 2008 and 9, global collapse of capitalism, was very uneven when it happened and how hard it hit different parts of the world. But in Europe, that little corner, little country, Greece is not a big country, was really the worst hit of anybody in Europe. And it's a long story, and I've spent time here talking about it, in the extremity of the suffering imposed on Greece. By the way, imposed on Greece by non-Greeks. In other words, even though Greece was an independent country, it had borrowed a great deal of money from private French and German banks. Some other banks, but mostly French and German. The French and Germans very eager to lend to them, got tremendous profits off of it. They weren't doing Greece any favors. Large banks rarely do that. So it was very profitable, but when the crash came, the Greeks were unable to repay, given the impact it had on Greece. Remember, Greece is a relatively poor country. It depends a great deal, for example, on tourism. If the rest of Europe is in terrible shape, as it was, then one of the first things every little family that might have gone to Greece from Germany or Scandinavia doesn't do that. And the Greeks were suddenly plunged into a problem. The difficulty was that with the Greeks having borrowed huge amounts of money, really extraordinary amounts of money, and the banks eager to lend to them, the inability of the Greeks to pay back put those banks already in trouble because of the crash of 2008 and 9 into a condition where they would collapse. They had already been bailed out, just like the New York banks were bailed out by this government. European, French and German banks had been bailed out by their politicians. And if the Greeks defaulted, they would require another bailout, and the populations of Europe wouldn't have allowed it. This was a real crunch. The solution was found by a few technicians. Here's what was done. The European, there's now a European government that's separate from each other country. The European government would come in and, here we go, promise to save Greece from defaulting by giving Greece a huge amount of public money from Europe. A bailout fund. Eventually 3 times they gave huge amounts of money to the Greeks, saying they were saving Greece. After all, it's the cradle of Western civilization. And if you believe any of that, then you should see more Democratic Party debates. Okay? Anyway, here's what was done. The Europeans gave the Greeks a big bailout on one condition, that they used it to pay back the debts they had to the French and German private banks. So who was actually saved by this hustle were the banks in France and Germany, which is why the French and Germans, who dominate Europe, arranged for this lovely game to be played. So Greece got out of its debts to those private banks, keeping them full of money, and now became a basket case owing money to Europe as a whole. Very little of this helped the Greek people. That would have been bad enough. But the Greek people, by and large, saw what I just told you. They did. And suddenly, in 2010, 11, 12, they changed their politics in a way that made the rest of the world's head spin. And if you don't know this story, you ought to. They had had for some time a very small political left-wing party, actually an alliance of little left-wing groups called Syriza, which actually means a collection of little groups, or something like that. And this party had gotten 2, 3, 4% of the vote. Suddenly, overnight, the mass of the Greek people, understanding what was being done to them, that they were being bailed out in order to bail out foreign banks, and that nothing was going to be done to actually help them. If you're not familiar, I don't have the time, Greek salaries, in the public sector, which is very big in Greece. Public sector is bigger, I believe, than the private sector in Greece. The public sector salaries dropped by half. Try to imagine what it would mean if the teachers and the social workers and the cops and the firemen all had their salaries cut in half. You know, a catastrophe from which the Greeks have not even begun to bail out. Visit Athens, you will see very quickly how different it is from other European capitals. It's just poor, very poor. So the Greeks understood they were being abused, and they voted for Syriza, and Syriza took power, won the election. Greece had been governed by two parties who oscillated. One was the Greek Socialist Party, and one was the Greek Conservative Party. And every few years, one of them had it, and then the other few years, the other one had it. Nothing changed. For Americans, this should look familiar. Republican and the Democrat, and the Republican and then the Democrat, and each time you're supposed to hope that getting rid of the one and moving to the other one is going to make a big difference. After 3 or 4 minutes, years, you understand. You understand that it doesn't or it won't. The Greeks, a bit ahead of us here, they understood. They voted for Syriza. The two political parties, having thought they would rule forever, as people in that situation do, gave themselves a lovely rule in Greek politics. Here's how it works. All the parties compete, but whichever party gets the largest number of votes gets that many seats in the parliament plus 50. This is very important. In other words, you get as many seats as the votes entitle you to plus 50, which means nobody can defeat you. Syriza, to everyone's surprise, won the election. A former communist, the Communist Party in Greece is an important political party and has been for half a century, if not longer. A former communist, Alex Tsipras, the head of this Syriza party, and makes as his finance minister Yanis Varoufakis, whom you have heard about, or if you haven't, you will, and who once joined me for one of these things that we do. I didn't do it in those days here, I did it at another place, but he's a friend and I brought him and we did one of these evenings together. And he has a new political party and it did quite well last Sunday. Even though the Syriza was defeated, Varoufakis' party is in the parliament now. They got enough votes to get into the parliament. So he's going to be a bit of a player in that part of the world. And then the Germans, led by the Germans, who are the dominant force in Europe, brought, as they were doing this bailout of this game, really squeezed Greece to such a point that the then head, the dying Socialist Party, which, by the way, in all of this has disappeared. The Socialist Party committed political suicide. And this is something you should pay attention to because the other socialist parties of Europe are in the process of doing the same thing, led by the French and others. Why? Because they promised to be opponents of austerity and all of this horrible stuff, but when they got elected, they not only didn't oppose it, they became the executors of it. They executed the program. The Greek Syriza did the same thing. It led Varoufakis, for those of you who know it, to quit his job as finance minister, to leave the party, to leave. He couldn't go along with all of it. Why? Because it reached a point where the old government now led by Tsipras, having changed, put it to a referendum of the Greek people. Remarkable step. The Germans and the French were enraged. They didn't want people to comment. They knew what would happen. And a majority of the Greeks voted not to go along, to quit, to refuse. It wasn't a binding referendum under Greek law, so Tsipras had a moment of decision. Is he going to break from all of this or not? He decided not to. And the last several years, he has been running an austerity program, cooperating with the Europeans, even though he was against it earlier. And last Sunday, the Greek people gave him their verdict. You're out. And the old conservatives came back in. And Lord knows what they're going to do in Greece now. But here's the lesson for all of us. This was, in a way, the last time that reform, going along with, hoping you can make a capitalism that isn't harsh, that isn't so unequal, that isn't so rapacious, that isn't so focused on the 1%, that it's still, you can work something out. And the system just crushed him, used him, and when it was done, boom, he's gone. No one will ever know what would have happened if he had decided, with the majority of the Greek people, not to do an austerity anymore, to break. No one will know. But the lesson has to be drawn by everybody else in a comparable situation. And one of those coming soon, two of them. One in Portugal and one in Italy, and I'll come back to the one in Italy a little later. Portugal is a similar situation. The government in Portugal, I'm sure all of you know this because the American newspapers explain this to you. Good, that's good. That was a good laugh for that, huh? The government of Portugal today is a coalition of three political parties. Ready? The Portuguese Socialist Party, the Portuguese Communist Party, and the Portuguese Green Party. I'm sure you are all aware of that. It's been true for years. They don't do austerity because those parties are against it. Portugal, by the way, refusing to do austerity, doing real well. Real well. Think about it. But it's a real tragedy in terms of a decision the left made when it had the majority of a popular vote, still not yet ready in its head to make the break. Not that there aren't risks with making the break, there are. But what they've proven is there are heavy risks if you don't. That has to be dealt with too. Okay, next. Over the last few days, a major event being swept under the rug with enormous energy, which is a clue that it's a major event. The largest bank in Germany is called, fittingly, the Dойче Bank. Deutsch is the German word for German, okay? Deutsche Bank is an immense global bank, has been for a long time. If you go down to Wall Street here, one of the biggest buildings and offices on Wall Street, Deutsche Bank. Okay, just to give you a rough idea of what happened there. They just announced a restructuring. That's corporate speak for we're in deep doo-doo. But you don't say that. You don't say anything like that. We're restructuring. Okay. The minute you hear that, hold on to your wallet. Okay. They're restructuring. Here's what it involves. It's going to cost a lot of money. $8.3 billion. That's a lot of money. But it's particularly a lot of money because at the close of trade last Friday, if you value the Deutsche Bank by multiplying the number of stocks, shares, by the price per share, the value of the bank was 16.6. Half of the value of the bank is going to be used for restructuring. That is very deep doo-doo. Very deep. They're firing 18,000 workers. That's roughly 1 in 4, 1 in 5 of their employees is going to be fired over the next 2 or 3 years. The minute you hear that, let this be a lesson in high finance. The minute you hear that, you know it's way worse than what they're telling you. Why? Because if everybody who works at that bank is asking himself or herself, 1 out of 4 or 5 are going. Is it going to be me? Is it going to be my cousin Harry? Is it going to be my office mate? And if they're fired, my office mate, what am I going to have to do what they did before without being paid anymore? Oh, maybe it's time for me to look for another job rather than simply wait for the axe to fall. Which means you're telling your entire labor force to run away. You're taking risks that are spectacular. You're going to lose all kinds of people, including some that you were going to fire and some that you weren't. And the more you tell a few of them, it's not going to be you, the more the people who didn't get that message know what that means. This is one of the biggest banks in the world. It couldn't save itself. You know it's been working for the last years. Its stock price, by the way, just for those of you who are interested in this, stock price peaked at $145 a share in May of 2007, just before the excrement flew into the cooling equipment, right? So in May 2000, see how polite I am? In May 2007, the share, $145 a share. Last Friday, stock closed $8.03 a share. You notice something? If you had invested your money in Deutsche Bank, you couldn't afford to come here this evening. Think about it. Think about it. When a huge bank like that fails, you know others are trembling. Why? Because if you know how big finance works, the banks buy and lend to each other overnight, every day. Banks have to keep certain ratios of assets to outstanding liabilities. It's the way that you protect against bank collapse. And so if a bank, at the end of the day, when the computer keeps up all the income outflow, if it's short, it borrows overnight from another bank that's in excess, for example. Yeah.
I'm just assuming that the executives at Deutsche Bank keep their bonuses?
Of course. They were embarrassed when they announced the 18,000, which I believe was Monday of this week. Someone leaked that day they had brought in a special haberdashery unit. I don't know if any of you caught this, which fitted the top executives for 2,000 euro suits. So on the same day, you know, it's always the same day that they were firing 18,000 people, they were spending a fortune for another suit for people who can't cram the suits they already have in the closets that their apartments have. But let's not go there. Banks help each other. If you're short, you borrow overnight from the other bank. So for example, somebody who Deutsche Bank is short. So they'll call up Citibank or Wells Fargo or Bank of America, any one of the monsters, and they'll have a loan overnight, 20 billion, 40 billion, 100 billion, doesn't matter, overnight. But now the question arises, wait a minute. We give them overnight $60 billion, and tomorrow morning they declare bankruptcy. What happened? You may get the money, you may not. You may get part of it back. But for sure, you're going to have litigation from here to tomorrow, and you're going to wait for that money. But you have your own obligations. Yes. That's why in 2008, in the last 4 months, the government stepped in, because that's what happened then. Nobody would lend to anybody else, because nobody was sure that the bank they lent to wouldn't do what Lehman Brothers had just done, which is say, we're not paying anybody anything. We're bankrupt. So when nobody lends to anybody, the system stops, because it depends on this credit all the time. If that problem hadn't been solved, nobody would have lent to anybody, and the milk and the bread wouldn't have come into New York City anymore either, because all that's handled through credits too. That's why the government had to step in, if you remember, those of you paid attention, and announced that the United States government will cover every debt of every major bank.
Taxpayers.
Absolutely. So you can go ahead and lend, because if the bank declares bankruptcy, it doesn't matter, Uncle Sam will cover the debt. You understand? These are people who celebrate private enterprise. They make fun of the government as the place of inefficient fat cats who don't do anything. And they were on their knees begging to be saved by the government, which did it. And on behalf of the banks, I want to thank all of you because you paid for it, which is why you have the problems in the American economy you have today. Deutsche Bank's effective near collapse leaves only one question. What's going to happen next? And that's the last part of his story. In a private capitalist system, we allow private capitalists to amass the kind of power and wealth that Deutsche Bank has. So they become, remember, too big to fail. Remember that? So you can't let them collapse because they take us all down with them. But you don't require them to open up so that you can avoid the catastrophe if they fail. So they can hide everything. Private enterprise. They could wait until Monday to tell us that they're going to fire 18,000 people. How long are we going to wait to find out how bad this is? How long are we going to wait for the other banks that are being yanked down by the failure of Deutsche to tell us? We live in a capitalist system. It's whenever they feel like telling us, or when it doesn't matter anymore because the game is up and the game is over. There's a reason why Americans have always been fascinated by stories of gangsters, whether it's the Old West or the Mafia or this group or that group, because everybody kind of knows that's not specially them, that's how everybody's doing it. It's only you're allowed to think it about these particular groups in order to protect yourself from facing the fact that it's everywhere and your family too. Anyway, let's go on quickly because we're running out of time. Wages are going up. This is a rare thing for me to say here in the United States, but they're not going up for most workers. They're going up for workers at the bottom. You know, the retail workers, the fast food workers, those people's wages are actually rising for the first time in a long time, faster than everybody else. Everybody else is basically going nowhere. The little bit of rise you see is mostly at the bottom. But it's complicated. Partly, it's because the people at the bottom are becoming militant. The fight for 15, some of you are aware of it. You see even demonstrators at the fast food joints and at the retail places. So it's that. Here's another thing. It's immigrants, a disproportionate number of immigrants, and they have a kind of double. They want the American dream, they want to get paid, but they are more militant in many cases than the American, Native American. That's changing the situation too. And here's another one. A growing number of college-educated people are unable to get any other kind of job, so they're busy making the coffee at Starbucks and giving you your fast food over the counter. And they were led to believe that they, because they're college students, are going to have this and that in their lives, and they're discovering that they're not. And they're not happy about it. So when the idea comes of a union and they're there. You put all that together, that's why you're having it. But then things got weird, because as often happens in capitalism, something that couldn't be stopped by the capitalists, they're not able to stop it now. Walmart has had to raise its wages. Target has had to, Costco, all of them. I mean, pretty much all of them are having to do it for fear that they'll lose their workers to the other one who's doing it. So, but they've all discovered, well, we can't stop it. Now, let's change our strategies. This happened before in American history. So Walmart and the others are now becoming advocates of raising the wages to $15 an hour. Don't wait until 2010 or 2020 or 2022. Do it right away. Why? Because the smaller companies they're trying to destroy will be destroyed by that. The little hardware store downtown can't pay $15 an hour. But Walmart in the mall on the edge of town, it can. And they will make up in rising prices after they edge out the little ones that still remain. It's becoming a competitive tool. The way that happened before in American history was when the efforts were made to demand that, for example, meat. Remember Sinclair Lewis, Upton Sinclair, these famous books about the meat industry and the drug industry. And if you read those books, you couldn't eat for a month. Remember they described how the animals were killed and the filth, which is endemic. At a certain point, all the businesses involved didn't want to have any regulation. We'll take care of it. We will self-police. That's another one of those democratic debate equivalences. You don't take that seriously. And people didn't, and they demanded that the government step in. And then the bigger companies realized, okay, if we can't prevent regulation, let's use the regulation. And suddenly they became advocates of more stringent rules for milk production or meat production. Why? Because all the little producers couldn't afford those machines. They couldn't afford those chemicals. They couldn't afford the inspections. And so they would fall by the wayside, and the only one left would be the big ones who, once everything cleared, would jack up the prices, which they could afford because there were only a few of them, and recoup whatever money they spent. And so it ended becoming Swift and Company made all the meat, and Borden's and a few others did all the milk because all the little people were basically wrecked. That's what's happening in high finance, which also should be called low finance. All right, next, quickly. The country in Europe that is currently in the deepest debt and therefore the most likely to collapse is Italy. It's very important you all understand this. Italy. The national debt of Italy is over $2 trillion. It is more than 130% of its annual income. It owes more than it earns each year. It is under tremendous pressure from the rest of Europe to do something about this for fear. The Italian government has borrowed unbelievable amounts, like the Greeks, only bigger. Italy's a much bigger economy than Greece. It has borrowed much more money. The French and German and American and British banks are up to here in lending to the Italian government, as are the Italian banks. Same problems. The fear, how long can this go on? And how trustworthy can everybody be with those banks that are so exposed to Italy? Suppose Italy can't or won't repay the debt. What happens then? Well, the debt is enormous. The only way the Italians can't pay or won't pay the debt is either if they don't cut government spending. Why would that solve the problem? Because if you raise taxes from your people, as the Italian government does, like every government, but you don't spend it on social programs, you can use it to pay back your debts, to reduce your outstanding debt by repaying your creditors, but anybody else would, right? So all you have to do is convince the Italian people to give up on a lot of their social programs so that the taxes they pay, instead of providing them with schools and hospitals, are providing the rich banks of the rest of Europe with money they want. This would be real popular in Italy. They have a government now of the right, but that's very shaky. That government can't do that. That would be committing suicide. They're not going to do it. In fact, this right-wing government in Italy is promising great new expenditure in Italy, for which it can't raise money unless it borrows more, which they ain't going to be able to do.
China is willing to do.
That's the new wrinkle. Very good. I was going to take a little more time getting there, but okay. Okay. What are the Chinese? No, but before we get there, what are the Chinese? What are the Italians going to do? Well, they could raise taxes, and they could get the money to pay off their debts, but that's about as popular as cutting social programs. You all know that. That's the same game we have here. They can't do any of this. They can't pay down the debt because there's nothing they can do. And in order to do the things the right-wing government has said it would do, it would have to borrow money. But the banks can't. It's against the rules of Europe. I mean, they really can't. Well, what are the Italians going to do? They don't know. But now in comes a new player, the People's Republic of China. And they say to the Italians, and the Italians are not the only ones, you're in a jam. We have loads of money. We will help you out of your jam. But you have to be nice to us. You have to sign up for the Belt and Road Initiative, if you know what the Chinese are trying to do in the rest of that, Asia and Europe and all of that. And you have to sell us some of your ports. The Chinese already own the major port in Greece. Piraeus is the Chinese company owns that port, and they want ports in. They want to control the trade routes. They're just doing what every other country like that has done before. There's nothing new about it. And the Italians are now seriously thinking about it, and that means the Italians will not relate to the United States the way they did before. These are things that nobody thought about before, and they are unfolding, and they are unfolding very fast. So my advice to you is to keep a sense on it. Okay. Scandinavia. Mr. Trump likes to crap all over, that's a technical term, crap all over Denmark. The poor Danes, a little country, you know, it bothers nobody. If you've ever been to Copenhagen, it's very relaxed, and they have a lovely garden in the middle of their city where people go, the Tivoli Gardens. It's a very pleasant country. There's no reason to crap on them. But Mr. Trump, well, what am I going to tell you? You already know. But things get said here in the United States about Scandinavia that are so wide of the mark about what's going on and what the differences are, that it forces us sometimes just to stop and just give you a little bit of an idea of what the differences are between what they do in Scandinavia and what they do in the United States. But before I do, let me make real clear to you. Most of the economic activity in Scandinavia is run by private capitalist corporations. You can call it whatever you want, democratic socialism, orange socialism, bumble mumble, you can call whatever you want, but that's fine, just as long as you understand what's actually there. The government plays a bigger role, you're going to see that in a minute, than in our society. But the notion that it is a fundamentally different society, that's just wrong. And it gets very messy when you go, that's socialism, this is capital. No, it isn't. You know, I understand you can define words any way you want, but let's be careful. So, right, you're with me? The majority of business is done by private corporations owned by private shareholders. They hire workers to whom they pay wages and salaries and all of that you're familiar with, because it isn't that different here. So where do the differences lie? Well, I'm going to give you some of them. Here's the first one. In the United States, the richest 1% of Americans together own roughly 20%, the income. The richest 1% of income earners get 20% of the income. Okay? That means the richest 1%, they're the richest 1% because they take a tremendous chunk of the income. That means the other 99% have what's left, but they get 20%. Okay. In Denmark, the richest 1% get 6% of the income. So you understand, there's a difference. They have a capitalist economic system with private capitalist enterprises, but they do not allow the level of inequality that we have. It's out of the question. In other Scandinavian countries, it's a bit higher. The peak is in Sweden, where it's 9%. The richest 1% of Swedes have 9% of the income. But we are in another league from these countries. We allow our richest people to be way richer relatively to the rest of the people than they do. They don't allow that level. There is no Jeffrey Bezos with $160 billion who divorces his wife, which happened since we last met. Let's have a moment of silence. Her name is Mackenzie, and the divorce is now final, and she will get, of the $160 billion, I want you to feel for a moment for her, $39 billion. Jeffrey is number one. He's the richest person on the planet. And after the divorce, Mackenzie will be number 22. Okay? This is extraordinary. Right? Jeffrey Bezos is using billions to prepare to go to the moon. His view of the future of our planet is about as bad as any one alarmist ecological person I've met. He's leaving. We, however, will stay. Yeah. Norway. Norway has the same per capita output, GDP per capita, as the United States. In other words, you take the total output of goods and services in Norway, divided by the number of people, you get the same number as if you take the total output of the United States, which of course is much larger, but we have a larger population. So the wealth per person we produce each year is the same in the two countries. However, Norway, unlike the United States, has a universal health care for everybody from birth till death. Child care, universal paid for by the government, child care. Elder care, tuition-free universities, 12 months of legally required paid parental leave. You get that? You have a baby, married or not, you have a baby, the parents, ready? Both of them get 12 months off at full pay with the guarantee of the job being there at the end of the year. Why? Because, believe it or not, they believe in, ready? Family values. Whereas by contrast, we don't. We talk about family values. We just don't do it. All right, last one before we jump.
Do they have automatic income caps in those countries to make sure that
a maximum income type of thing? Not that I'm aware of, but I'm not 100% sure.
how do they keep someone from acquiring more and more and more?
They have very high rates of graduated tax structure. So when you cross certain things at high levels, you're starting to talk. By the way, remember, some of you have been here before. I've explained that to you. We used to do that in this country. The top bracket in the United States, say in 1944, was 96%. Every dollar you earned over $10,000 a year then, which would be about $400,000 a year now, but every dollar over $10,000 in 1944 that you earned, Uncle Sam took 96 cents, you kept 4 cents. That was the law passed by the Republican and Democrats in the House of Representatives and the Senate and signed by Mr. Roosevelt. Yeah.
So I've had a libertarian friend of mine comment on that, insisting that the de facto taxation was actually much less because of loopholes.
Yeah. Always true. That is correct. Your libertarian friend is correct. These are what's called statutory rates. If you have loopholes, if you have exemptions, if you hide stuff, you can make the de facto rate much lower.
So he uses that as an excuse or as a reason why we should not go back to the way it was, because it really never was that way.
Yeah, but that's called a logical non sequitur. I mean, yes, people have violated the law. That's the argument. Well, then, why have a law? What? You know? But, you know, libertarians have to stretch to hold on to their beliefs. Anyway, yes?
What do you say to those who argue you can't compare the two countries because of the scale of the U.S.?
Yeah, there's a point. I mean, the United States is a big country. These are small countries. There is a point. Those are different things, and they should be taken into account. I don't make the comparisons. I'm responding to the fact that our leader thinks it's important to make these comparisons. He's the one who craps all over Denmark and wants to make fun of those societies. It's part of why I use per capita, so we're not, you know, we're adjusting for the fact that they're different. But yes, they are different societies, but I don't think that invalidates the differences that they do. And the proof in the pudding is the things that are done in Scandinavia, we did some of them. In fact, many of them at various points in American history. So the idea we can't do it is bizarre. In 1944, apropos Steve's question here, 1944, Roosevelt proposed a maximum income. The way he did it was in the State of the Union message, 1944. Some of you know about Roosevelt's Declaration of Economic Bill of Rights and all of that. Bernie recoups some of that in his campaign. But his proposal, President Roosevelt's proposal was every dollar over, remember the 10,000? That's what was really rich people in those days. Everyone who got over 10,000, the tax rate would be 100%. That's the proposal that the President of the United States sent to Congress. That's called a maximum income. Because if you have to give every dollar all 100 cents, that means you can't earn more than that. They just come in and take it from you. That's a way to avoid inequality of income. Having less inequality than we do is easy. There's nothing complicated, nothing difficult, nothing. That's a purely political issue. If the support is there, I can assure you, in 3 days, I will assemble economists like myself and we'll do the work and get it done. We'll have some accountants and some lawyers and we'll get together. This is trivial. Countries have done it, including us. We know how Mr. Roosevelt had it worked out, how he would do it. We will do some It's purely a political question. Is the support there to do it? We're done. Is the institutional arrangement there to sustain it? We're done. Don't let anybody tell you it's complicated. Oh, yeah. Ooh. Anyway, one more quick before we turn to the major topic. The BMW Corporation. I want to talk to you a little bit about Bavarian Motor Works, BMW, Bayerische Motorwerke in German. Okay, been around a long time, very famous company, makes top-of-the-line cars. Sold here in the United States, you know. Okay, the two biggest shareholders are Suzanne, I want to introduce you. Suzanne Klatten, 57, who is distinguished as, ready, 1, 2, 3, the richest woman in Germany. That's quite a distinction, okay? She's worth an estimated, according to Forbes magazine, $19.8 billion, which makes her poorer than Mackenzie Bezos. And she owns 19.2% of the shares of BMW. She has a brother, Suzanne does, Stefan Quandt, Q-U-A-N-D-T, and that's the name you want to keep in your mind, Stefan Quandt, 53. He owns 23.7% of BMW and is worth an estimated $16.7 billion. They were asked, by the way, the story from which this is taken is from Fox Business. Just so you know that my sources are very carefully chosen. They were interviewed by Fox, and here's a quote from them. I'm going to read it to you. For both of us, this is Suzanne speaking. Oh, I'm sorry. It's not Suzanne, it's her brother Stefan. For both of us, it's certainly not the money that drives us. But here comes the best part. Above all, it is the responsibility of securing jobs in Germany. In other words, German capitalists, like their American counterparts, think of themselves as job creators. Only they add job preservers. If you have that much money, you're crazy. That's what this is. You lose your connection with life, or at least life as everybody else lives it, and you live in a place where crapola like this is what you say publicly to reporters who then report it. But that's not the only reason I want you to hear this story. I want you to learn a little bit about the history of the Quandt family, which is where Suzanne and Stefan come from. They are descendants of the Quandt family dynasty, which was a big conglomerate in Germany before it purchased a huge block of BMW shares in 1960. In 2007, a television documentary aired in Germany that was a study of the Quandt family across the 20th century. In this film, the following, I'm going to read you from it. The Quandts were linked inseparably with the crimes of the Nazis. Joachim, Scholtisek, the Bonn historian who compiled and researched the study, concludes at the end of his report, published in 2011, the family patriarch, Günther Quandt, was part of the Nazi regime. He and his son Herbert, who headed the dynasty during the Hitler period, willingly collaborated with the Nazi regime by employing an estimated 50,000 forced laborers in its factories. An average of 80 slave laborers per month died at Quandt factories, and many who rebelled were executed. Recalled Takis Milopoulos, a Greek who was a former laborer at a Quandt factory in Hanover, that's a city in the north of Germany, during the Second World War. We were treated very badly, we were whipped, and we had to drink water out of the lavatories. The family, Quandt, has admitted to all of it. That's very interesting, for those of you who don't know how the Germans have dealt with that part of their history. An execution area for disobedient slave workers was set up at least one of the Quandt plan. The Quandt family commissioned a study of their own history after the movie called The Silence of the Quandt Family was aired on German television. The family admitted in a statement at the time, quote, "We recognize that in our history as a family of German industrialists, the years 1933 to 1945 have not been sufficiently accounted for," which must qualify as the understatement of at least 2 centuries. Günther Quandt, the leader of the family, was arrested and interned at the end of the war in 1946. But the judges concluded that he was a mere Nazi fellow traveler. He was released in 1948, so he was in jail for 2 years. After, the ironies here are really much, after he got out of jail, he joined the board of the Deutsche Bank, was honored by Frankfurt University in 1951, and while on holiday in Egypt, he died in 1954. His descendants are the richest people in Germany today and the major controllers of the BMW automobile. The next time you hear of the glorious way in which huge capitalist enterprises went from a little enterprise to a big one by dint of hard work and perseverance, you should throw up.